So thanks for that strong introduction. So it's actually quite special for me to be here in Romania. I've never been here, this is my first time here. And actually when I was starting out my journey into Bitcoin in 2013, I started this blog called My Coin Story, where I just kind of like went over how I was learning technology, the problems I had, the questions I had, and also me losing a lot of money with trading. I was not a good trader. There was a webcomic called Frito and Pigeon. Actually, I made sure to wear, oh, you know it, awesome. So I made sure to wear that, my Frito and Pigeon shirt. It's about 5 years old now, when I first arrived in Romania. And they only had one web strip about Bitcoin. It was about people complaining that they didn't buy Bitcoin a year before. And so I think it was Pigeon who said, I created a coin for you, and it's called Bitchcoin. And so I actually emailed them and I asked them, hey, can I use it on my blog? And they said yes, and they were very nice. We talked a little bit about Bitcoin. Sadly, I don't think they're here today. I think they're in Bucharest, but I just want to say thank you in case you're watching. So yeah, my talk today is about Bitcoin fueling the decentralized ecosystem. I'm not going to go over an introduction of myself, otherwise I'm just going to keep talking and talking and talking. And since we only have a little time, you do not want that. But you can follow me on Twitter and add me on LinkedIn. If you do add me on LinkedIn, please include a message, because I used to work in web marketing doing ad placements, and I still get people trying to sell me ad space, despite not having done that for about 5 years now. So the first point I want to make is that decentralization is a scale. A lot of people try to say like, oh, is it this or that? There's even some services out there like, are we decentralized yet? It's a website created by Jackson Palmer. He's the guy who invented Dogecoin. And you hear a lot of discussions about, oh, it's not decentralized enough. The second one is actually correct, because it's scale. So, for example, so let's say there are 5 miners in the Bitcoin ecosystem. I know there's a lot more, just work with me for this. This is a little bit decentralized. Miners 2, 3, and 4 each kind of mine 2 blocks each. This one's a bit more decentralized, where all 5 miners have mined at least 1 block. This is very centralized, obviously, since miner 2 mined all of the blocks. And this can apply as well to, having a copy of the blockchain. So I understand that it's about that's being distributed, but generally the more distributed the network is, the greater opportunity for being decentralized. So if it's like this, you don't have to, like, let's say miner or node number 2 is down, that's okay. You can download the blockchain from 1, 3, 4, and 5. So is more decentralization good? Not always, but it can be. Mostly because good is a very subjective term. What's good for me might not be good for you, and what's good for you might not necessarily be good for me. Another misconception is that decentralization is automatically equal to independence. It's actually not automatic, although it helps one achieve it. So I'm going to oversimplify things in a very basic way. Hopefully I don't make you too hungry with this example. So I pride myself a little bit as a home cook. I love cooking French cuisine, although my fiance hates it when I take 1 hour and 30 minutes to set up dinner. But the first dish I actually learned to cook properly was crepes. I still remember it. It's 1 cup of flour, 1.5 cups of milk, and 2 eggs to make the batter. Yes, I'm using the metric system, but blame my German friend who was in America for giving me that ratio instead. So over the years, I've kind of been perfecting the recipe and here and that, and I prefer cooking for myself. Usually if I see a crepe stand, I just walk past it and I look at the price and say no, I'm not spending that for that. But I still go to restaurants. And I still eat crepes sometimes, especially if it's quite good. Now, if the means of production, or memes of production, as Theo likes to put it, was controlled, and let's say, I couldn't get flour, and flour production was completely controlled by the government, and the government would only sell flour to specific restaurants that maybe they were friends with. Sorry. Then I wouldn't be able to acquire it. So then I'm less independent. I have less options of being independent because of certain centralized efforts. So again, it's not automatic, but there are certain things that can be pushed to reduce my freedoms because of centralization, and there are ways for me to become more independent with more decentralization. So again, because it's a scale, there's actually a lot of aspects in the world today that are on the scale of decentralization and not fully centralized. First example is the world. You might be asking, why in the world am I using this map? It's because my stock photo subscription could only get me this map. So there's many different governments around the world, and yes, they try to come together. There's United Nations, European Union, and stuff like that. And according to some other people, there's an underlying global government. But at least publicly, that hasn't been fully confirmed. And we still have various governments around the world constantly fighting with each other, as you probably have heard in the news. Can anybody name me what city or country this is in? Nope, but close. Yes. So this is the city of Vaduz. That's the castle up there where the prince lives. Liechtenstein is actually quite an interesting country because it pushes that a little bit further. I mean, we already have the United States with various states, various countries in Europe that have certain regions that have certain levels of independence. Liechtenstein really pushed things further. They actually allow any municipality in the principality to leave Liechtenstein and become their own country. It's actually formally recognized in their laws. That's a quite considerable amount of decentralization because then if the town decides, okay, no, we don't like the government anymore, we're just going to leave. And they can do that pretty much at any point in time. And the prince cannot do anything. Open source software, we see a lot of decentralization with that. Now, I understand that there's some open source software that's developed by a single company, but with things like the Apache Foundation, the Node.js Foundation, we see a lot of actually competitors working together and collaborating. So, for example, if a certain software has various maintainers, like let's say from Intel, IBM, and things like that, it doesn't rely on a single one of them for the project to move further. And of course, there's various other contributors that can continue to bring the project further in case, you know, all of the maintainers are gone. But is it enough? And again, this brings back to what we are comfortable with. For me, I'd like to see more decentralization in the world. For some people, this is fine the way it is. And that's, you know, for me, that's okay. I think we're entitled to our own opinions, and we have the right to have them. But again, I still want to push further on it, and I've encountered a lot of issues that you can't really go that much further without Bitcoin. And that's why my title of the presentation is about Bitcoin fueling the decentralized ecosystem. So as mentioned, there's a lot of governments in the world. They fight with each other. And occasionally, there's some governments that come together. And I do recognize, because of this, I do recognize that governments are not very good representatives of the people of those nations. They come together and try to choke, essentially, another country down or push them down with sanctions and things like that. So I used to live in this country. Can anyone guess what this is? If you've seen my presentations before, you're not allowed to guess. I said if you've seen my presentations before. Okay, so I used to live in Fiji. And it was a fantastic time to live there. I mean, the circumstances were not that good. And it was a dictatorship while I was there. Now, it was paradise, don't get me wrong, but it was still a dictatorship. It wasn't that evident to me as a foreigner, although I started feeling it the more I worked in the country. But it was very evident on how it affected the people around there who worked and received money from abroad. I met one web developer, and he was with a team of 4 others. They had to shut down their company because they could not receive any payment at all. Not because they couldn't get clients. They actually had a significant amount of regular return customers, but because all of the payment systems stopped working with Fiji. Not because of what these 5 people were doing, but because they were in a country that was a dictatorship that they had nothing to do with. And so, I mean, MoneyGram actually still kind of allowed the payments, but they charged essentially about 2 times the daily minimum wage to receive a payment. So that was just completely out of the question for anybody working in Fiji. If there was Bitcoin, if they used Bitcoin, I did try to help them with it, but by then when I met them, it was already too late. Actually, the dictatorship ended 1 month after I left Fiji, and the prime minister was the former dictator. So that's quite interesting. But Bitcoin wouldn't care if the person receiving it is in a dictatorship country. All that matters is that the person sending it sends it to somebody else. It's peer-to-peer. And because it's that way, we are less centralized in the sense of like governments controlling the way we are able to operate in an economy. Bitcoin fuels us to become truly connected to each other without somebody saying, no, you can't, because of what, again, somebody else has done. So going back into a whole world view, governments really love controlling the ecosystem. I mean, that's kind of how they stay control, stay in power, and continue to grow. I really recommend this book. It's called The Dictator's Handbook. It's actually quite scary. Its thesis is about how democracies and authoritarian governments are quite similar. I mean, yes, there are certain differences, of course, with either one. I'm not saying that they're equal, but a lot of things about them are quite similar. So for example, politicians generally have the desire to, one, come to power by maybe saying or doing some things that get them elected. The book tries to mention this thing called the power broker circle. So these are the people that control the media, control the military, and things like that. In authoritarian governments, there are fewer of them, so it's a bit easier. In democracies, it's a little bit harder, but still possible. Two, of course, is to stay in power by doing the same thing, keeping people happy, and making compromises, perhaps, in order to maintain that power. The third one is to keep control of the money. If you study a lot of dictatorship histories and seeing how they've changed, it's actually interesting because it's about following the money. Once they start losing the grip on their money, you can quickly see that the dictatorship has changed hands. Also the same case, of course, if the dictator's dying and then somebody else can come along. But usually the person who comes along is the person closest to the money. So going back to my example with Liechtenstein about them being able to leave. If they leave, they currently use the euro and the Swiss franc. They mostly use the Swiss franc. So if one of the municipalities leaves, they'll probably continue using it. It might be okay for them because they're quite small and quite wealthy, so they'll probably be happy with doing it. But let's say they were using, let's say that a European Union country instead leaves, and they're using the euro. And for some reason, they also choose to leave the Eurozone. It can cause quite a significant amount of logistical nightmares, to say the least, political battles, and it could become essentially a bargaining chip when deciding whether or not to leave, just because they are using the euro, because it's not something that they might necessarily have enough control over. If they were using, I don't know, my slides are out of order, sorry. If they were using Bitcoin instead, it wouldn't matter. So, I mean, the monetary policy is essentially the same. I mean, yes, they would still have access to whatever Bitcoin reserves they have. As was mentioned in a presentation yesterday, Bulgaria has a decent amount of Bitcoin, and I would assume that most countries moving forward would start acquiring them too. But it's not like they could continue printing more, or it's not like they could just issue their own currency and say like, okay, we'll just print a crap ton, devalue everybody else's money, and essentially tax everyone without consent. So I'm not going to talk too much about open source software because Peter, Todd, and Max already went quite in depth about it. Just wanted to bring up about being more, having more of the freedom to be able to audit something and being able to know what something is properly, what something is meant to be doing and whether it's actually doing that. I actually asked Peter after his talk, that was the question that I was supposed to ask. How does one who's not a developer check to make sure that what I'm using is actually, doing what it says? And unfortunately, he said, like, well, there's two ways. One, learn the code, and two, hire a coder. So, but it's nice to have that option because, when I use Microsoft Windows, who do I ask? I can only ask Microsoft. I can't ask a friend of mine. I can't learn the code and crack the binaries and make it an open source thing. I can't do that, so I'm more controlled. I really love this quote so much that I made sure to wear the shirt with the quote today. So it's by Linus Torvalds, the inventor of Linux. So in a real open source, you have the right to control your own destiny. And one other thing that Linus is not really that known for outside of the open source space is that he invented this thing called Git. Not GitHub, although GitHub uses the Git code. He actually made it because a lot of people were giving him crap for using a closed source version control software. Now, we've seen obviously a lot of open source collaboration, as I mentioned already early on. But one of the biggest problems is that a lot of these people aren't necessarily rewarded. Now, for me, when I contribute to open source projects, I don't care about financial reward. I'm just pleased to see something work. I'm happy when what I built or contributed to, because I'm not a developer, so if I contribute to documentation, that people actually read it and it's helpful for people using the software. It benefits me a lot. I'm happy about that. But for some people, it's not enough. And so they either join a company that prevents them from continuing to contribute to the open source project, or not too often, but let's say a company finds somebody who's contributed a lot and likes what they're doing, tries to hire them. Unfortunately, there are some cases, not all, some cases where after the person gets hired, they're no longer properly able to contribute to the projects that they once did. Luckily, with Bitcoin now, we've started to seeing a lot of these tips that get sent around decentrally. I mean, people in the past could, of course, use payment systems like PayPal and so forth, but it's really created this culture of just sending each other coins because, oh, it makes, I see you're doing good work, here you go. Or when people contribute to the Bitcoin software, they see that the work that somebody else is doing is financially benefiting them. So I just want to finish this off, again, with the last statement. Decentralization is not independence. Bitcoin helps you achieve independence by pushing decentralization forward. So, thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.